but someone asked thoughts on patriotic socialism. I know you all had thoughts about this in the past. I wrote about it. I will say this. There's been a lot of silence about this lately. I feel like it was almost like this internet phenomenon, and now there's less. I don't know if there's less passion for it, or maybe the arguments against it just won out, which is I tend to think that's the case. But given that there's a silence on it, but it is a legitimate trend, you know, and it is rooted in history. I don't know if you all have thoughts about it now, given how it had this internet moment, so to speak, not too long ago. What was that, 3 to 6 months ago?
Yeah, when we talk about right-wing shifts on the left, I think that is certainly one example of it. I think it is ultimately sort of a failed project, and a lot of the people behind it aren't really taken super seriously on the more principled anti-imperialist left. I think they show the weakness of their own position when they just talk and try to extend this idea. I mean, I've worked in fast food kitchens. I've worked all the shitty jobs you can possibly imagine with, like, you know, lower working class people my whole life, and never once were any of them patriotic. Like, you know, if I'm trying to like get together the colonized people of the U.S. or get together the lower working class of the U.S. to think that I'm going to do it by appealing to what is now a wholly right-wing sort of thing, which is the American patriotism, flying the flag of imperialists and capitalists and white supremacists and slave owners. It's already a lost argument. I think the people on that side are overwhelmingly, I personally see them as overwhelmingly like white dudes. And I think a lot of them have a conception in their head when they think of the working class as like a white guy with a hard hat on. And so maybe that guy's a little more conservative socially. Let's appeal to the working class through this American patriotism bullshit. But in reality, the working class in the U.S. is multiracial, is many different genders, many religions, many different political perspectives, and very little traction can be gained by going in there flying American flags. I mean, fascists now fly American flags. You know, like every right-wing fascist rally that you see in the U.S., you are 100% guaranteed to see the American flag waving. There's nothing to be gained by trying to go over to those people and say, "Hey, we like the American flag too." I mean, it's nonsense. It's reactionary. It's chauvinist. It comes out of a very white, male-centric view of the working class, and it's ultimately a dead end. And we'll see. We'll see. It will never work. It's been tried before. It hasn't worked. It won't work. Go ahead, keep spinning your wheels in the mud and see what happens. But yeah, it's absolute silliness in my personal opinion. I'm never waving the flag of my capitalist overlords. I'm just not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely was just an internet phenomenon. As Brett, you mentioned, this has been tried in the past. You know, the CPUSA tried doing this before. What was the result? It was an utter failure, and so much so that they expelled the guy that was the head of the party that was pushing for it, Bill Browder. You know, he was pushed out of the party because of how stupid the strategy was back then. You know, I was that white guy with the hard hat on. Like when I was in college, I did seasonal work as a manual laborer, fixing roads, you know, taking care of the city's parks. You know, I messed up my back doing that. Like that was me. I was with all of those people. I'm from a town that's all white. Literally, like it's one of the whitest places you'll ever see. And the people that I was working with, you know, they fell into basically two camps of people. One were like somewhat liberal, not, you know, super socially liberal, but somewhat liberal because they were in a union. It was a manual labor, you know, working for the city. So they were in the city's union. And then we had these very conservative, religious, white, you know, your typical, what you would picture when you hear Trump voter, right? And a lot of them were Trump voters. So they really fell into these two camps. And you could see this clear distinction. All of the people that fell on the conservative side of the argument all had American flags and some Confederate flags, despite the fact that I was living in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Like literally, I have a Canadian accent, and these people have Confederate flags on their trucks. Like, what is this? But those people all had American flags on their vehicles. And the people who were, you know, maybe even socially conservative, but they were voting for Democrats because of their union ties, they didn't have American flags on their things. You know, they weren't super patriots. Like maybe if the United States, maybe they were in favor of the Iraq War. I don't know. Many of them probably were. Most of the United States was. That was a very, very popular opinion when the Iraq War started, in large part because of media disinformation, but that's a different story entirely. The point is that when you have these people that are claiming to be patriotic socialists, and they're trying to push the American flag, what is the goal? The goal is to try to get these somewhat conservative, patriotic people onto the side of what? Socialism? What are you trying to connect with these people on? You say, okay, these people are patriots. Let me wave my flag and that'll bring them onto my side. What other things do you have in common with them? Maybe you say, well, this person wouldn't be averse to universal health care. I mean, that's a pretty popular opinion in the United States. If you're settling for universal health care as your rallying cry, are you really trying to convert the person to socialism? Because universal health care unto itself is not socialism. Universal health care is not what we build a socialist or communist movement around. And that is what, the only thing that you might try to get in common with them other than the American flag? It's a very, very strange strategy for trying to actually advance a socialist cause. What you really seem to be doing is trying to push for some sort of like red-brown alliance that is married to American patriotism and perhaps one or two other issues that socialists and some conservatives might agree on, like universal health care or something like that. Like, it's a very, very strange position to take. It's not a winning argument. Historically, it was not successful. And really, the main reason that it was being done was because it was getting people views on YouTube. It was getting people likes on Twitter. The people weren't actually going out into the street with American flags and like talking to working class people and saying, join a vanguard party and like, we're going to institute a dictatorship of the proletariat. What do you think about that? This isn't the work that these people were doing. They were waving their flags on Twitter. They were putting on American flag onesies, dyeing their beard red, white, and blue. And they were doing it for likes. They were doing it for views on YouTube, and they were doing it for the discourse. They weren't doing it to actually advance any sort of socialist movement. It was a deeply unserious movement. It was entirely rooted in the internet. So in summary, it was stupid.
Well, I don't want to take too much longer on this, and maybe I'll throw in another question, and then Adnan, you can jump in. But I just want to say that there's just a few things reflecting on this that I just want to point out. One, it seemed to always be rooted in sort of electoralism and posturing around that. So I think the working class here is totally and entirely viewed within the voting so-called public on both sides of the political aisle. For example, you will hear commentators who are patriotic socialists or socialist patriots or whatever. They'll cite this poll that happens every year around whether people are proud to be an American or not. And it usually pulls it's usually a super majority. It's usually a very large majority of people who are polled. But these are the same people who will then question polls about, let's say, the U.S. elections, for example, when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were, having it out, and it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win. That the thing about polls is that they're very suggestive and that they do not take into account the actual class character of the United States. I consider myself a working class person. I've never taken a damn poll for anything, for any sort of Pew Research poll or anything like that. I don't know about you guys, but it never has happened for me. No one that I know has ever done that in the workplaces that I've been in. I have actually literally known very few people who are that involved, because usually you have to be very involved politically in terms of the two parties. You have to be very kind of like card-carrying Republicans and Democrats to really be engaged in those things. So usually what you get is sort of an idea of what the duopoly thinks, and people who are very impassioned about the duopoly. And of course, they're American patriots. Of course they are, because they're American exceptionalists, and they have their own contending views of what will make quote unquote America great and why it's already great under their stewardship and rule. And so I always found that to be so disingenuous, especially now that we are in this era of the so-called white working class and disillusionment and all this posturing about it. But in these same places where this so-called white working class is being dispossessed of agency and all of this, usually just Trump voters as characterized as working class white people, you forget that most places, like let's say in the Midwest, there's a lot of cities that are majority black, majority working class, and their opinions ever taken into account? How their voting activity, what they've done over the course of history to try to assert their political agency, and also to to struggle to survive under the system? No, it's always just it's like this white makes right kind of worldview that also negates history. And it was just ridiculous to have conversations and debates with people who, and I actually lost a lot of supporters. I don't know why so many people who supported me thought that I was like some sort of patriot, but I guess they thought so because I was very much forthright that you can't negate history and call yourself a socialist or a revolutionary or a communist. You can't do it. You have to acknowledge the fact that the only reason capitalism exists in the United States is because of slavery, white supremacy, because of indigenous genocide, and how those things are ongoing, and how there are modern manifestations of this that have actually caused among real people an actual disillusionment in what everything about this country represents. And it makes no sense if you talk to real people. And if you do, and one of the questions that we had was, what's the importance of organizing outside of the internet, or outside of on the online space? And I think the importance of it is that it's really about education. What Mao said, it's not just books that teach you what the world is all about. That's not the only form of education. You have to be rooted in the people. You have to be rooted in what's happening in the real world. And patriotism, American patriotism, seems to be way far away from being a legitimate form of struggle for any sort of positive thing that we could be fighting for as a class, as a movement. So I'll just leave it there.